Hello, everyone. You probably know me by now. My name is Kristen Hood, and I'm the Executive Director of Research Engagement at NephCure Kidney International. Today's NephCure U webinar is on the genetics of rare kidney disease, and we are so excited that you're with us. Before I introduce our speakers, I do want to let you know that we will offer a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So in the last 10 to 15 minutes, we will answer questions. You can submit questions throughout the webinar. Just use that Zoom toolbar, the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, and you can ask questions throughout the program. We will answer as many as we can. We will end the webinar punctually at 1 p.m. Eastern, so we will keep that in mind. I'd like to thank Natera today, who has helped make today's program available to you. Natera is a global leader of cell-free DNA testing with a specific kidney gene panel that may help people find an underlying cause of their kidney disease. I will provide more information on Natera and other genetic testing resources in an email following this presentation. And now I'd like to introduce to you our speakers. Dr. Ali Gharavi is the J. Meltzer Professor of Nephrology and Hypertension and serves as the Chief of Division of Nephrology and the Director of the Center for Precision and Genomics in the Department of Medicine at Columbia University. You can see why this is a gold star speaker that we have with us today. After receiving his medical degree at George Washington University, Dr. Gharavi completed residencies in internal medicine and a fellowship in hypertension and nephrology at Mount Sinai Medical Center. He then completed a postdoc fellowship in human genetics at Yale University and joined Columbia in 2003. Dr. Gharavi's research is focused on the molecular genetics of kidney diseases, and his work has led to the discovery of genes for IgA nephropathy and congenital defects of the kidney and urinary tract. His recent research has demonstrated the utility of sequencing in the diagnosis and management of patients with kidney disease, and he's extending his work to other adult disorders. His ultimate goal is to bring personalized genomic medicine from the laboratory to patient care, and that is why we have him here today. And before I let him start the session, I'm going to introduce to you Natalie Vena. She's a certified genetic counselor. Natalie received a Master's of Science in Genetic Counseling from Boston University and is currently working in a joint position between the Institute of Genomic Medicine, Division of Nephrology, and the Center of Precision Medicine and Genomics at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. She serves as a primary resource to patients and physicians regarding genomic research and precision medicine initiatives, and is involved in variant annotation and curation, as well as returning genetic test results to patients in the both research and clinical setting. She holds a faculty position of genetic counseling and is involved in the training of students enrolled in genetic counseling program at Columbia University. I have to say, Dr. Gharavi told me she was his favorite. So that's why she's here today as well. And with that, thank you so much, Natalie and Dr. Gharavi, for being here. Dr. Gharavi, please take it away, and you may share your slides and get started.
Well, thank you very much, Kristen, for this kind introduction. And I wanted to thank also NephCure for inviting us to give this talk. And so today I'm going to tell you about my favorite topic, which is the genetics in kidney diseases and the value of genetic testing. When should you think about it? So I'm going to start with some general things. We're here because we all developed from a single cell. Whether in that single cell, which was fertilized, basically a fertilized egg from our parents, it gives rise to who we are now. And so whether we are a sea urchin, a mouse, or a seaweed, we all start from the same material. And this single cell essentially contains the blueprint for our development. So if we start to go into a bit more detail, I'm going to put this into presentation mode. So you could see that if you look at a given cell, it has a center called the nucleus. The nucleus contains all the genetic information that we need. The genetic information is packaged into chromosomes. In humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes that can be stained, as you can see here in this picture to the right. And so one chromosome each from one of our parents, and this just and so that's how we wind up having the instruction for development. Inside the chromosome is the DNA, the genetic material that is basically, if you unwind the chromosome, you could see that this is the DNA is there. The DNA sequence has 4 letters in its alphabet: A, C, T, and G. And over 60 years ago, we deciphered the genetic code, and we understand what is the sequence of these ACGTs mean, and how do they encode for proteins, which then come together and then lead to the development of an organism. And so DNA sequencing technology became really available in the late 60s. And then, now the task was to be able to sequence genomes to be able to understand what this how many genes we have in the genome, and how this DNA code winds up coding for things. And when do we have typos in the genome, which may then result in, disease sometimes. So this is sort of like a sequence of DNA that you could see. This was one of the first, DNA sequences of bacteria that was published. And so just to give you an idea, it's been a long time coming. We know a lot about DNA. What's really changed in the last, I would say 2 decades or so is the ability to have a comprehensive catalog of DNAs in the genome for multiple different organisms, including humans. And so there was a big effort from the NIH, the public sector, and there were also the private sector was also engaged in this effort called the Human Genome Project. And so this started as an idea in the late 80s. And then it took about 10 years to put together a draft of the human genome. That was the goal of the project. It took about 10 years and $3 billion to sequence essentially an entire human genome, one human genome essentially that became now the reference human genome that every biomedical researcher on the planet really refers to. And what was evident is that there are 3 billion nucleotides, or 3 billion letters in the genetic alphabet. And so that's what we all share together, but there's variation in these 3 billion letters, and roughly, 1 in, 1,000, maybe 1 in 300 base pairs or letters vary between different individuals. And the challenge was then to understand which typo, which variation is disease causing, whereas which typo is completely part of just variation in human beings and has absolutely no impact on any kind of clinical outcome. So just to give you also a perspective, War and Peace has about 3 million letters in it. So, reading through one copy of the human genome is like reading through 1,000 copies of War and Peace. And so really that's the challenge that we have now, is to identify that one typo in these 3 billion letters to be able to see, to distinguish what might be disease causing. So this has become available, it took 10 years to generate one copy of the human genome, $3 billion. But fortunately now we have advances in technology that enable us to sequence an entire human genome in perhaps 24 to 48 hours, and then at the cost of under $1,000. And so the real challenge is the interpretation, as I mentioned, to read through these, use the computational approaches to sort of filter through all these different changes in the alphabet and identify the causal variant. And so, the challenge has also been how to translate all this information into clinical care. But fortunately, that has become increasingly possible because we know a lot more. We've sequenced now, over 1 million people across the planet, and that number is going to augment significantly, to the point that I predict that most people will have their genome sequenced one way or the other in the next 10 years. And so as a result of this, then we've learned a lot about genetic variation in the population. So when can we tell, based on a clinical evaluation, that somebody has a genetic problem or a hereditary problem? So I'm flipping back now to the clinical side. We have this genetic information, the ability to sequence genomes. How do we select who should get genetic testing? Because that's still not completely widely available, and there are still some limitations to genetic testing. So some telltale signs for physicians to consider, and also patients, and I'll tell you more about this a little bit later, is the family history of kidney disease. It sort of makes sense, right? If you talk to people who have any kind of kidney disease in general, about 1/3 of them will tell you that they have a 1st or 2nd degree relative who also has a kidney disease. And so that tells you that there are hereditary factors involved, and particularly in that group of patients, there's a strong possibility that there may be a genetic disease running in the family, and so that should be a first telltale sign. Early onset of disease also makes sense. Genetic diseases tend to present really early, childhood, adolescence. So again, we make a mental note whenever somebody has an early onset of disease, but I think that number is going to change, and that right now we think about people age less than 40 when they have onset of disease, but we've also seen a lot of people who are older than 40 who have genetic diseases that have gone undiagnosed. So, but that should be a sort of a rule of thumb. If there are multiple organs that are affected, for example, you have a kidney problem, you have a heart problem, or there's a kidney problem, or a hearing defect, or an eye problem, so multiple organs affected, then you have to think about a genetic disease, because that typically happens in the genetic disorders. In some populations, there's consanguinity. In other words, there's intermarriage within the same family. And so that increases the chance of a type of diseases called recessive diseases. And so that's something to think about as well. So if the parents of a patient are related in some ways, first, second, third degree relatives, then that's something to think about in terms of increased chances of having a genetic disease. And then your doctor will also tell you whether there's a possibility of genetic disease based on clinical tests that they've done, such as blood tests, urine tests, or potentially a kidney biopsy. So all of those are possibilities, and I think should be kept in mind. As we're learning more, we're finding more specific criteria for who should get genetic testing, and so we'll have more information down the line. But I think these are good general guidelines. So what can we learn from genetic testing, and what does it matter for kidney care? Well, there are a lot of patients whose kidney disease are not completely firmly diagnosed based on the clinical workup. And so we can identify the genetic forms of disease based on the genetic testing. In addition, within broad categories of kidney disease, something like nephrotic syndrome, for example, 5 to 10% of cases may have a specific genetic cause of disease. And so, and that's not discernible based on a standard clinical workup. And so with genetic testing, you can identify the subgroup of patients who have a genetic forms of disease. The genetic diagnosis can sometimes help with selecting the treatment options. For example, as I said, the nephrotic syndrome case is one example where the genetic forms of disease don't typically respond to the standard first-line therapy for nephrotic syndrome, which is immunosuppression. So if the patients don't have a genetic diagnosis, then a genetic form of nephrotic syndrome, this shouldn't be treated with immunosuppression because that can only expose them to the side effects of medication and not the beneficial effects. There are certain types of kidney disease which also for which we have targeted therapy. For example, Fabry's disease is one example of a rare disease which affects multiple organs, including the kidney. There's a deficiency of an enzyme, and if we diagnose this, then we could provide that enzyme as a therapy. Hyperoxaluria is another example of a disease which, there's a production of oxalate, which then damages the kidney, and that there's no new targeted therapy available for those disorders. And there's that growing list, which can be very helpful. Some genetic diseases can cause many complications. Not all of them occur at the same time. And so by knowing knowledge about them, we can try to do surveillance and try to detect them earlier to prevent damage to other organs as well. Hearing problems, eye defects, heart problems, and so forth. If it's a genetic disease, then there may be family members at risk. And so again, we can screen at-risk family members again, and there may be appropriate therapies available to prevent or reduce the progression of kidney disease. Finally, some patients with kidney disease can have, may require transplantation. And so we can screen family members for identify those who don't carry a genetic mutation, and then would be suitable donors for transplantation. And then, of course, there's a lot of family counseling we can do. Everybody's interested in having a family and having children. And so understanding what are the risks of passing this down to the next generation is really important. And Natalie Vena is going to talk about this in more, greater detail in her talk. So what is the utility in general for genetic testing in kidney diseases? We recently did a study where we sequenced 3,300 patients with different forms of kidney diseases. And overall, we identified a genetic diagnosis in 9.3% of patients. So roughly almost 10% of patients had a genetic condition. And you could see down here is the diagnostic yield and what fraction of the patients actually had a genetic disease when we looked at their clinical diagnosis. Okay, so this is the overall group that we looked at. And then looking at the subgroup based on their kidney diagnosis, based on the clinical diagnosis, the standard workup that you get when you come to see a doctor or a nephrologist typically. And so if the clinical diagnosis was some hypertension or diabetes, diabetic kidney disease, then we still had 1 to 2% of patients who had a genetic cause of disease. Whereas, I don't know why this is advancing. Whereas people who had congenital or cystic kidney disease, in almost 1 in 4, we could identify a genetic cause of disease. And what was really important for us to realize is that about 10% of cases of end-stage kidney disease or kidney failure, the kidney disease etiology is unknown, and we can't discern what the cause is based on just a clinical workup. And by genetic testing, we were able to get a cause, identify a cause of disease in 1 in 5, 1 in 6 cases. So that was very gratifying. So let me give you a genetic testing scenario. This is a 57-year-old who was referred to us with newly diagnosed kidney disease. On kidney biopsy, he had this a pattern of injury called focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. And typically, these types of disorders are treated with immunosuppression. So as I mentioned, this is a form of nephrotic syndrome. And he came to us for a second opinion. We reviewed his biopsy, and we weren't sure, but we weren't quite sure he had focal segmental glomerulosclerosis as the primary diagnosis. And so we wound up opting for genetic testing, and we saw that the patient actually had a dominant form of Alport syndrome. Alport syndrome is one of the common causes of kidney disease. It's the known recognized genetic form of disease that really, in the classical description in the textbooks, presents with blood in the urine, hearing defects, some specific findings on kidney biopsy that tell you that, to lead the clinician to think about this disorder, and some eye findings. But what we found from our sequencing projects is that this particular description of Alport syndrome only occurs in a subset of patients, maybe 30–40% of patients, but other people have more non-specific findings, such as this patient. And so this was really important for the management, because here we told them to avoid steroids, and we referred them for a clinical trial that's actually targeting patients with Alport syndrome, because there's a lot of clinical trials now in nephrology that are targeting specific diseases, including Alport syndrome and many others. And so directing folks to the right clinical trial may be really beneficial. And then we started screening family members who are at risk, and then to identify potential donors should he need a kidney transplantation. And so this is what I was referring to earlier, is when we looked at our patients who had mutations that were diagnostic of what we'd usually call Alport syndrome, or a related disease called thin basement membrane disease. We had 92 such individuals, and only 40% of them had a clinical diagnosis that were recognized as having Alport syndrome, whereas the majority of patients were classified as having other diseases such as FSGS or kidney disease of unknown cause. And for this category of patients with FSGS, this was really important because they may have been exposed to immunosuppression without really, expecting any kind of benefit from this. And so being able to refer this group of people to the right clinical treatment and screen their family members is going to be really important. And so that's one example. So one thing I wanted to tell you about genetic testing, so it has many good options, but we also have limitations still. So if there's genetic testing done, it doesn't mean, and it's negative, we don't find anything. Well, that happens in 90% of the cases, but it doesn't mean that there's a clean bill of health and no genetic disease at all. So that needs to be quite understood. The chance of developing a genetic condition, not the exact chance of developing a genetic condition, cannot be determined through genetic testing. All genetic conditions cannot be prevented or cured. And scientists don't understand everything about the genome. And so there's a lot of work to be done to answer many of these questions. So all these statements that were here in the positive as declarative sentences are actually false. And so we're developing tools to be able to better educate our patients, and NephCure is doing the same. And there are a lot of different resources that are available now on the web to be able to guide you through understanding. So this is like one example of something that we've developed, and Natalie will tell you about this. So for example, if the letter says no genetic risk factors will ever develop the disease that have been tested. So the answer is, well, no, your risk of getting those disorders really hasn't changed. And we'll tell you more about some of these as we go forward. So when should you ask about genetic testing? I'm going to repeat this again. So if there's a family history of kidney disease, if there's early onset, usually typically aged less than 40, when there are multiple organs that are affected, when the cause of kidney disease cannot be identified based on a standard clinical workup, there's a chance that the genetic testing may give you an answer. When there's consanguinity, so intermarriage within the family, and then there's specific findings on a biopsy or clinical tests that your doctor will tell you about, and then may raise the possibility of genetic testing. So in summary, I would say genetic testing can be really useful for diagnosis and management of patients. In about 5 to 10% of patients with glomerular diseases and other types of kidney disorders. The genetic information can also help with selection of kidney donors and family planning and counseling, and then identifying people who are at risk. There's still many limitations in the medical interpretation of the genome sequence data. So this work in progress, and if we don't have the results today, we may get results down the line as knowledge accumulates. And then we're involved in a lot of research studies that can hopefully help improve our understanding of the interpretation of genome and bring the results back to our patients. And so, like I said, the negative test does not rule out the possibility of a genetic disease, and it doesn't obviate the need for continued medical care. I mean, this kind of makes sense, but you should keep that in mind. And then talk to your physicians or seek advice from a genetic counselor when you have questions about genetic testing. You hear more about from Natalie about what genetic counselors do and how they can be helpful in this path. So I'll stop here and look forward to the next part of the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Gharavi. We are going to get Natalie on to share her slides and get her talk going. I want to remind everyone there is a genetic testing poll open in this webinar. If you haven't answered it, I would encourage you to do so. Thanks so much. And Natalie, take it away.
Great, thank you. So as Kristen mentioned, my name is Natalie Vena. I am a genetic counselor that works with Dr. Gharavi in the Department of Nephrology and in the Center for Precision Medicine and Genomics at Columbia University. And so thank you, Dr. Gharavi, for giving that introduction to kidney genetics and for everyone joining me today and allowing me to talk about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, being a genetic counselor. So I've heard it said before that if you know what a genetic counselor is, it's probably not a good thing. Now, for those of you who have heard of a genetic counselor under not so great circumstances, hopefully today I can prove to you that that is a false statement. And for those of you who do not know what a genetic counselor is, my plan today is to introduce to you what I think is pretty much the coolest profession in the world, although, I'm obviously biased. So today I am going to introduce to you the profession of genetic counseling and what a genetic counselor is. I'll describe to you when and why you might need a genetic counselor and what happens in a genetic counseling session, and discuss some of the benefits of and resources for obtaining genetic counseling. And I'm going to do this both broadly speaking, but also in the context of kidney disease. So let's begin by talking about who genetic counselors are. So genetic counselors were master's level trained healthcare professionals who are nationally certified and state licensed. Despite what my father thinks, we are not medical doctors, though we do have advanced training in both counseling and genetics. And we often work part of the healthcare team to guide, educate, and support individuals and their families who are seeking information about their genetic health. Traditionally, genetic counselors were primarily found working in healthcare settings, such as those with women who are pregnant or potentially planning a pregnancy, or in the cancer setting with those who had a personal or family history of cancer, and in pediatrics, working with children with ultra-rare disorders, intellectual disability, or birth defects. These days, however, genetic counselors can be found working in a variety of settings, including healthcare and private sectors. Some work directly with patients, while others may never see a patient at all. We can be found working with insurance companies, developing policies. We work with genetic testing labs, writing reports, in marketing, in education. And now, like me, we're increasingly found working with adults and diseases that are more common and not traditionally believed to be genetic, such as chronic kidney disease and kidney disease in general. However, regardless of where we work, most genetic counselors have the underlying goal of helping individuals understand their DNA and how that might impact their health and their lives in general. Well, as stated early, some of the common reasons why someone might see a genetic counselor include if they're pregnant or thinking about becoming pregnant and are concerned about the health of the pregnancy, or there's a personal or family history of cancer, cancer at a young age, or a strong family history of cancer. So multiple people and multiple generations affected. Maybe you or your family member have a known genetic disorder, a rare condition, or a birth defect. You're interested in genetic testing or have genetic test results that you want to understand, or you're just concerned about your risk for genetic disease in general. In my role in nephrology, I work with individuals and families at risk of kidney disease and related disorders to help them find answers to improve their health outcomes. So how does this happen, and what happens during a genetic counseling session when you go see a genetic counselor? So genetic counseling appointments typically happen in a healthcare setting, either in person or increasingly commonly more remote as well, via telehealth. These appointments can also include a geneticist or maybe even a specialist with expertise in genetics. And we start by assessing your risk for genetic disease by reviewing your family and medical history. Here we look for, we review your health information. We may ask you specific questions and look for clues in your history that may point us to one genetic condition or another. We also review your family history and look for similar clues in other family members because we know genetic disorders can run in families. In nephrology specifically, we tend to look to see how old you were when symptoms first started, how quickly disease has progressed, since we know that genetic disorders involving the kidney can happen, are more common at a younger age in more severely affected individuals. We look to see if you have any other features or other medical problems beyond your kidneys. So, maybe your ears are involved, your hearing, maybe vision, because we know that these genetic disorders, they can sometimes affect multiple body systems. And then we look for specific lab values or biopsy findings, as these can point us in one direction or another and make us more suspicious of a genetic disorder or less suspicious as well. We often look to see if there are similar or related symptoms in other family members, because again, genetics can run in families and they can have a family history of disease as well. We then take all of that information and may make recommendations for either a specific or broad genetic test based on all the information provided. And the whole end goal is to try to identify a genetic change in your DNA that may explain all of the symptoms. There are broad genetic tests that look at several genes associated with kidney disease. We can look at all of the genes in the body with a test called an exome test, or we may even look at specific genes, one individual gene, if we have a suspicion of a particular disorder. During this session, we discuss the benefits and limitations of these specific tests, and we answer all questions you may have about the test, the process, and most importantly too, the possible results. And then when results are back, a genetic counselor can help you understand and make sense of these results in the context of your specific health information and family history. We also help you process the complex emotions that come with discovering that you have or are at risk for a family or for a genetic condition, and help you find resources and advocate for your health across the board. So this is traditionally how a genetic counseling appointment goes, but with nephrologists becoming more comfortable with genetic testing, direct-to-consumer testing, so patients can order genetic testing on their own. Patients can pop in and out of this process at basically any point. And genetic counselors and genetic counseling, are here and designed to help you at any stage of this process. So now you may be sitting here thinking, like, I know I have a kidney disease or any other disease for that matter. Why should I see a genetic counselor or get genetic testing? And that's a great question. So why would someone want or need genetic testing, and what can you do with these results? So first and foremost, I do want to stress that the decision to see a genetic counselor and have genetic testing is incredibly personal, and a genetic counselor will never pressure you to do any particular testing. Instead, we walk you through the pros and cons of testing and help you make a decision that's best for you in your current circumstances. But there are some advantages to genetic testing and reasons why people with kidney disease or related disorders may choose to undergo genetic testing specifically, which I will discuss in a moment. But one of the common reasons that people do genetic testing, regardless of for the reason, is for answers. So let's say, for example, you have stage 3 chronic kidney disease, you have blood and protein in your urine, your doctor, your nephrologist is treating your kidney disease by managing your blood pressure and managing everything with medications. And so far your kidney function has been pretty stable. However, this really doesn't answer why you have kidney disease in the first place. You know, kidney disease runs in your family, for instance, on your mom's side, so you assume genetics has something to do with it. But you know, you're still kind of left with this unanswered question of why. Well, genetic testing may be helpful for you to figure that out. And sometimes just knowing the cause of the disease may be helpful for some people. In addition, genetic testing can help identify other people who are at risk for disease. Genetic conditions can follow different inheritance patterns, so they can be, depending on the condition and gene involved, so they may present differently. The risk for a genetic condition may be different for different individuals. And so knowing what condition and what gene is involved would better allow us to predict who in the family is at risk of developing a disease. And this becomes particularly important in two settings. One would be for family planning and reproductive choices. And specific in nephrology, this also comes into play with kidney donor selection for transplantation. So with family planning, this really is considering the risk to future children or your children or future offspring and better understand the risk of passing the disease down to them. And with donor selection, something that is relatively unique to kidney disease, especially when we're considering familial donation, if there is a specific disease running in families, we want to make sure that when we're thinking about donation and choosing the right kidney from the right individual. So knowing who in the family is at risk for having a genetic condition would also be beneficial in this situation. And lastly, or one of the last reasons that I will touch on specifically is for management and treatment and guidance of disease. So ultimately, at this point in time, we can't cure genetic conditions, but knowing what causes them may provide your physician with more specific guidance when treating disease. So for instance, a specific medication may be maybe indicated or maybe contraindicated depending on the condition that's involved or the genes that are involved, or maybe a new therapy can be initiated. There may be other screening tests that the doctor would recommend or we would recommend for other organs that may be involved, since genetic conditions can involve other organ systems. And it may even help predict the clinical course of the disease. So are you more likely to progress to end-stage renal disease? Maybe the progression is slower or faster, depending on the condition. And even more relevant too, I think understanding your genetic contribution to disease is important with clinical trials. So there's an evolving world of clinical trials in the nephrology and kidney setting. And for some of these conditions or some of these trials, it may be necessary to either rule in or rule out a genetic component for participation. So now, after talking about what a genetic counselor does, I do think it's important to quickly note what we do not do. So just to drive the point home, we will never force someone to undergo genetic testing. We are not in the business of creating designer babies or even eradicating disease. We don't share your private health information with people who should not have access to it. And while we do have counseling skills, we are not licensed therapists. So this is not a traditional counseling setting either. And also important, we don't treat disease. So we may make recommendations based on the genetic information to test other family members, maybe see other specialists or do additional testing, but we won't and can't treat your underlying health condition. Since we're not doctors, we do not make medical recommendations. We definitely leave that up to the doctors, the medical doctors, and the nephrologists. But in the end, regardless of the motivation for undergoing genetic testing and seeing a counselor, our ultimate goal is to empower people by helping them gain access to important health information and helping them make sense of their genetic information and improving their overall health. Now, before I finish up, I do just want to point out one thing that I think often gets confused in the genetics space. That's the difference between clinical and research testing. So everything I talked to you up until now is what we would consider clinical testing. And this is where we're doing a specific test to diagnose, either rule in or rule out, a genetic disorder. There is immediate impact on the patient, as these results will become immediately available. They are linked to their name and date of birth, and so they go into their health record. This testing is subject to specific regulatory guidelines, just to make sure that the labs or whoever's doing the testing is doing it accurately and interpreting the results correctly. And it's based on the current knowledge of the field. Research testing, on the other hand, this may be done to diagnose specific conditions, but it's typically not subject to the same regulations as clinical testing is. So it may not be done in what we call a CLIA lab or a certified lab. It's typically done anonymously, so the researchers don't have a way or don't necessarily know how to link it back to a particular patient. And while depending on the research that you're involved in, there may be a way to get these genetic test results, it is really study specific. And one of the main reasons why people do research is to build on the current knowledge. So there actually may not be a direct benefit to patients at that point in time, although each study is different and the end goals are different for each study as well. So research and clinical testing, they really do fill different spaces, and it's important to note that they are not mutually exclusive. So people can do research testing and they also can do clinical testing. And it really shouldn't impact one aspect of care. Okay, so now that we talked about what we do and why we do what we do, being genetic counselors, practically, I think I wanted to give you some resources to help you think about in case you're interested in learning more. So there are about 3,000 genetic counselors in practice, and we are located throughout the country. If you look at the first website here listed, findageneticcounselor.nsgc.org, this is a website that can help you identify genetic counselors in your area and by specialty. They also have additional information about genetic testing, the process, and everything like that as well. And a bit closer to home at Columbia, we do have a kidney genetics clinic that sees patients with a variety of kidney-related indications. We see both adults, we see primarily adults, but we do have the ability to see children as well. We are currently seeing patients via telehealth, so remotely by a video appointment. So, that kind of does alleviate some of the physical barriers that come up with genetic testing. And we do take self-referrals as well when appropriate. So this QR code here, you can use that to access our online appointment form, and it would just provide some information that would then help us indicate whether or not a genetics appointment is appropriate for you or not. And then lastly, I did just want to point out a few more resources for those of you who have genetic forms of kidney disease. As I mentioned, there are more and more disease-specific clinical trials, but navigating that space can be a bit daunting. So NephCure, well, in addition to being a fabulous resource for genetic kidneys related information in general, they have this link here on how to help find and connect you to clinical trials. And so I highly suggest you check that out if you're interested. And yeah, so with that, I just want to conclude and thank everyone for letting me brag a little bit about being a genetic counselor. And feel free to contact me with any questions, or I'm happy to try to answer some now too.
That's great. Thank you so much. We will go ahead and you can stop sharing and we can get to some of our questions. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to go ahead and enter in your question in the Q&A section. We do have a few questions that have come in, Natalie. If you're wondering where Dr. Gharavi went, he did have to walk towards the hospital, and he's going to try to log back in whenever he gets there if he has cell phone service. But Natalie is going to be able to answer probably most of these questions. And if not, we can get Dr. Gharavi to answer them in a bit. All right. So one of the first questions that came in is from Ed. And he just found out this last week that he has an 11-year-old boy that has dense deposit disease. He's wanting to know, is this a rare kidney disease? And so Ed, yes, dense deposit disease is a rare disease. It is actually in the category of C3G nephropathy, which is mediated by autoantibodies that form in the body. There are some genetic abnormalities that mediate this particular disease. Not 100%. So about 10 to 15% of dense deposit disease or C3GN diagnoses are mediated through genetic abnormalities. So if I could answer the question for you, I would encourage you to talk to your physician about genetic testing. And also, just to let you know, Ed, while your child is 11 years old, I would keep your eyes and ears open up for clinical trials that might be opening into your space. Right now, pediatrics only has one clinical trial in the pediatric setting within rare kidney disease. So that might be of an interest to you as well. It is not something targeted for dense deposit disease, but just keep your eyes and ears open for that. Dense deposit disease does tend to be pretty progressive, especially whenever diagnosed so young. So Ed, I would encourage you to make sure that you have a kidney doctor that is very in tune with rare kidney disease. And if you want to ever connect with me, you can email me at khood@nephcure.org. Natalie, anything to add to that?
Nope, I think that hit it on the head.
Beth Ann has a question. She's wondering, is there a panel of genetic testing that identifies kidney diseases like the panel testing for the BRCA or the breast cancer gene? And I'm going to expand on this a little bit, Natalie. I'm kind of curious if you will talk to us about the difference between targeted gene panels like Beth is asking, and what's the difference between that and like a whole genome or a whole exome testing?
Yeah, those are great questions. So to answer the question that Beth Ann proposed, yes, there are a lot of genetic tests that exist out there for kidney disease. And there are what I would call three main broad buckets of genetic testing. We can do single gene testing. So this is where you look at one gene, you sequence it, so you spell check the gene start to finish. And this is typically done when there's a very high risk of having a very particular condition. So for instance, in polycystic kidney disease, most of those conditions are caused by two genes, PKD1 and PKD2. So if you're interested in doing just targeted testing of that would be one indication to do that. Then we have what we call these broad panels, where we're looking at anywhere from 2 or more genes upwards to sometimes 500 genes, even more. And these are typically more targeted towards a specific phenotype. So and a phenotype being a particular way a disease is presenting. So things like kidney disease, like breast cancer. And this is just basically a big way to do a nice screen to look to say, these are the genes that are most commonly associated with the disorder that this person has. Let's look at those genes first. This third test is whole exome sequencing, and this looks at all of the genes in the body, all the regions that make proteins, which are the functional parts of our body. And this is a really, really broad test. And one of the main differences between doing the different tests is, number one, what we're looking for. So do we have a very specific condition that we're looking at, or does this person have maybe kidney disease, hearing loss, other heart problems, that we have to look at more genes outside of just what we're considering for kidney disease. The other thing is more practical and is coverage by your insurance company. So testing is not always covered by insurance. Some tests are covered more often than others. So in a genetic counseling session or a genetic counseling appointment, we also look at that aspect of, your picture as well, to make sure that we are recommending the right test for you, including coverage and cost.
That is a great point, Natalie. So basically what I just heard you say is that people can actually make an appointment with a genetic counselor before they get genetic testing, so that they can maybe try to target the right test. So perhaps insurance could cover it, is what I'm hearing, is that's part of the process that you would help try to make that as easy as possible for the patient or the caregiver.
Exactly. I think there's a couple things that came up, other questions that came up in the chat too. So like, what's the insurance, what is the barriers for keeping nephrologists to doing this. And honestly, one of the things is just practical considerations. So nephrologists typically, they're used to ordering, they may or may not have special background in genetics. So we really are the ones that will help you interpret the results, but also find the best test for you. And I think that is one of the takeaways for this, is that it's not a one size fit all for genetic testing, and each person's situation is very unique. And, they may be looking for, even if you present the same way, you have different circumstances, you may want different information, and a genetic counselor will help you work through all of that and figure out what is the best test for you, at this point in time.
That's great. That's great. So a question from Gary. He was asking something pretty specific as far as the genetics related to his specific disease. He's been diagnosed with idiopathic membranous nephropathy. So if Gary is interested in genetic testing, would that particular, if he has that particular diagnosis, could he come to someone like you, a certified genetic counselor, and they would be able to tailor maybe genetic testing to help him look at why and look at possible treatment options around the testing results?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, one of the things to note is that not all of kidney disease is genetic. And
That's
so
right.
I think one of the things that come up is what presentation, how do people look like with kidney disease that are more likely to be genetic? And that also happens in one of these genetic counseling appointments. We do work with specialists who are nephrologists, especially Columbia nephrologists, who have specialized training in genetics. So they're more familiar with the genetic forms of kidney disease. And they also can help us think, do we need to look beyond the standard set of genes? Is this more likely to be genetic or less likely to be genetic based on how this patient is presenting? And one of the parts of the genetic counseling session is to, make you familiar, get on the same page with you as to what are you expecting out of this test. So, if you do have idiopathic membranous nephropathy, that is not always genetic. In fact, it's rare. It's pretty rarely genetic. So part of this is making that informed decision to, set expectations. So even though you're doing this genetic test, the yield is likely going to be low. And so, knowing that going into the testing can help set expectations. And that also happens during this genetic counseling session as well.
That's really great information. I have a couple of questions. Dr. Gharavi was able to join us again for just a few minutes for some questions. Dr. Gharavi, I have a question for you, if you don't mind. I'm curious, with the widening availability of genetic testing, do you see that kidney doctors are incorporating genetic testing as part of their diagnosis process?
Yes, absolutely. Now that genetic testing is becoming more available, there's a lot of interest in genetic testing, both from our patients and as well as doctors, because there's a lot of information out there available. We know there's utility in other fields of internal medicine or medicine. Genetic testing is used much more frequently, for example, for cancer care or neurologic disorders or developmental disorders. And nephrology now is seeing a real increase in the use of genetic testing from nephrologists, general nephrologists, as well as subspecialists. So I think that number is only going to increase over the next few years. And that will become part of the routine armamentarium.
Yeah, so the poll that we had going, Dr. Gharavi, 72% of the people who answered it said that their kidney doctor has not ever talked to them about genetic testing. How would you guide the participants today in what should they do next if their doctor has not talked to them about it?
Well, so as Natalie also mentioned, and I was saying, is that the clinical diagnosis that you have really drives the probability that there may be a genetic condition involved. And so your doctor may have looked at this clinical diagnosis and felt pretty comfortable that, let's say, if you have hypertensive or diabetic kidney disease, then it's very unlikely that there's a genetic cause of disease here, or membranous nephropathy, the type of Mendelian monogenic disease that we're talking about here in terms of detecting. It doesn't mean that there may not be hereditary predisposition, but the type of really rare diseases that we're talking about in terms of detecting are less likely. The other thing you should consider is the summary that I gave in terms of if you have a strong family history of kidney disease, if there's early onset of kidney disease, there are multiple organs that are affected, there are some specific type of diagnoses which again increase the likelihood, then it's okay to ask your doctors about it and see whether they can revisit this. And so that I don't think is a unreasonable thing to do. In addition, there's new genetic knowledge accumulating. And so maybe last year there was no availability of genetic testing because we didn't know about a genetic form of that particular disease, but then this year we do. So I think it's okay to ask your doctors about it, particularly if there are some of those issues that are highlighted or relevant to your case.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Natalie, Becky had a question. If they've had genetic testing, would they need a referral to talk to a clinic to have clinical genetic testing or have an appointment with a genetic counselor? I think I'm reading that right.
Yes. So no, not necessarily. One thing I will say is that insurance does mediate sometimes what specialists you can see. And we do bill insurance for our appointments, but because they are seen with a medical provider. But one of the resources that I provided was our little QR code for our appointment. We do take self-referrals. And, as Dr. Gharavi stated, like not all kidney disease is going to be genetic, and there are some conditions or some, ways that it's presenting that make it less likely genetic. And we do review those and can come up, we'll discuss with our patients or potential patients whether or not it's most appropriate. But no, we don't at this point need a referral. We do take self-referrals, but always check with your insurance if you're planning on paying for using your insurance to pay for things.
That's great. That's great. Someone has asked, what are the risks of a patient getting genetic testing? And they specifically asked insurance with a question mark. Can you speak to the insurance risk around genetic testing, or is there a risk?
Yes, I can. So this is also one of the things that we discuss during genetic counseling appointments. So one of the things that comes up a lot are a concern from patients is genetic discrimination. And so this is where people use genetic predispositions or genetic information to discriminate against you. And right now we do have national laws. It's called GINA. It's the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And that law prevents insurance companies, health insurance companies, from using genetic information or genetic predisposition to either deny you coverage or increase your coverage or increase your premiums. So it makes genetic discrimination from an insurance level, a health insurance level, illegal. Also, the same thing with employment. Employers who are not federal employee, like the federal government, or have a certain number of employees, they also cannot use this information to deny you employment either or fire you. So there are national laws in place. One of the things that does come up is that this doesn't always carry over to long-term disability or life insurance. So those are considerations that we do discuss before people do genetic testing. If they are interested in doing having a life insurance plan or anything like that, make sure that we do talk about how they may not discriminate. Like it's not guaranteed that they're going to do that, but these results will go into your medical record. So anyone who has access to that medical record will be able to see these results and use them however they decide to. So they could increase your cover or premiums. They could not deny you a plan, things like that. So that is a consideration.
That's great information. There's a couple questions around using that QR code that you provided to try to access an appointment with a genetic counselor in your kidney clinic. If it is for a pediatric child, does the child need to be in the meeting? And is this done virtually? Which I think you said yes, it can be.
So these are done virtually right now. One of the benefits about genetic testing these days is that even though you can get DNA from any cell, so we can do cheek swabs or spit samples. So I don't need to be in person to collect a sample from you. Also, one of the things that we don't really do is physical exams. So I ask a lot of questions. The doctors ask a lot of questions. We may ask to look at your ears or your fingers on Zoom or something like that. But traditionally we don't need to do a physical exam. So that allows us to do these appointments virtually and access people where we typically normally or traditionally haven't been able to access them in the setting of minors. So that actually is a little bit tricky. So typically, when we are doing genetic testing, we do want to consider the minor themselves. And so make sure that they are comfortable with genetic testing, especially if they can, what we call assent to testing. So if they can, we do want to make sure that they are involved in the process. Obviously, they're not going to have the health information that a parent would have. So I would say, they should be involved in the process, but we're going to be talking with the parent most of the time and making sure that they understand too, the parent and the child, the implications of having genetic testing. That is where, there isn't the issue of like cognitive decline or intellectual disability or anything like that, or there's like a healthcare proxy, things like that. But if the child is capable of being involved, we try to get them involved as much as possible.
That's great. Thank you. Rebecca asked, and Natalie, I think this is for you too. Rebecca said that she had genetic testing done by a company called All of Us. And she doesn't know if they checked for kidney disease. She has FSGS diagnosed by a biopsy. So do you know about that company? Could you give her a little guidance? She's wanting to know, should she ask for additional testing from her doctor?
Yeah, so All of Us is actually a research program that Columbia is involved in. So the goal of this is to get, I think, 1 million people sequenced, a diverse population. And so as part of this research study, there are different arms of it. So I don't think that all of them will check for kidney disease. And if they do, they won't necessarily return results to you. There's some caveats on that specific research program. But just because you participate in that does not necessarily mean that you shouldn't do genetic testing. They are different, they are mutually exclusive. And yeah, sure, ask your doctor, see if they have any thoughts on whether or not it's genetic. And FSGS can have a genetic component to it, so that is one that does come up pretty regularly too, that we see.
Right. I would say that All of Us will not return any results that are really directly relevant to kidney disease right now, but that might change in the future. And so we're working on it, and I'm very involved in All of Us and make sure that the kidney field is definitely included as they return results.
That's really good to know, because there are other research-based institutional genetic testing programs that you don't always get results from. So that is good information. Dr. Gharavi, one last question. We're almost at the top of the hour. I do have a question for you around FSGS. We know that one type of FSGS caused by a genetic variant with APOL1 disproportionately affects the Black community. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on how genetic testing can address maybe some of the disparities, and how maybe we can go about helping in this area.
So APOL1 is one of the common risk variants that increases the risk of kidney disease in African Americans. But so I think in that sense, it's not in all African Americans. Prior studies had shown that in general, African American ancestry is associated, or African ancestry is associated with increased risk. And we see that a lot of it is attributable to APOL1. So already right then and there, by identifying those who carry these risk alleles, we can really just focus on that subset of patients, typically about 10 to 15% of the population of African Americans who are at really increased risk. So that's already providing precision. And then among those people, only a subset, maybe 5 to 10% of them actually do develop kidney disease. And so we're trying to identify other factors that are involved. And so including environmental factors, socioeconomic issues, and biological factors. So we are getting towards more precision and identifying that subgroup that's really at much highest risk. And there are ways of incorporating this already into clinical assessments. But I think we need to do more work on it. And there are a number of studies that are underway that will give us more answers in the next few years.
It's great. It really is true. And the whole point, this is the final goodbye of our session. I appreciate everyone for being with us today. Remember that genetic testing can help some of those with rare kidney disease find better treatment options and understand their disease more. So to find out more, you can always go to nephcure.org. I will be sending an email tomorrow with more information and resources, just like Natalie gave us today. So thank you everyone for coming, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Natalie.